because he was kind of clearly using again and had stopped there for a good amount of time, he might have left that area with somebody else to go do something else, maybe to go get drugs, maybe to go find food, maybe someone offered him a ride, and that could have gone south.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Myles Reiff. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Guys, as you can see, I am back in my lair. I've got my background set up. I'm actually settled in my new home. I am off the road. I'm no longer in England. I'm no longer in a hotel room. I'm actually in a house with beds and my dog and my cats and my wife and my child, and I have lighting and my books and everything is good again. So I'm happy to be here, and this is where we will be shooting everything moving forward. So thank you for bearing with me for the last several months as my background changed and my camera wasn't so great, but the stories still were coming through, and you guys seem to stuck with us. Our numbers are actually up. Our subscribers are way up. So we appreciate it. And maybe I didn't even have to do this, but this is the way it's going to look from now on. So today we are doing something a little different. As you guys know, our model is that we won't touch a case unless we have active participation from either family members or people who have actually been working on the case in some way, investigators, private investigators, whatever the case may be. Today we're actually covering a case where we have spoken to the family, but they have not gone on camera with us. Now, we do know from our conversations with the subject's mom that she does want the case covered. She has spoken to us about it multiple times, but there's just been some reticence from her to actually appear on camera and actually move forward with the process. But she does want the story out there. She does want the coverage. So Sean and I have decided that this case is important enough that we want to get it out there. So we're covering it for you today. So this is going to be kind of a standalone case breakdown, and it is about a man named Rico Harris.
Yeah, it's interesting, Miles. I mean, we've run into it a couple times in our careers, but also on this project where cases like this are sort of underreported. You know, they might be well known in sort of a really specific niche like web sleuth community, but the broader public probably hasn't heard of them. And I think Rico Harris's case is one of them. And talking to Rico's mom, it was interesting that she really lamented that fact and wished that there was more press attention to her son's case, while also finding it really painful to talk about and not being super comfortable doing an interview. So it is a sort of a, I want to call it a unique situation, but the fact is it's kind of not. I mean, we run into this from time to time. In fact, we have a couple other cases that kind of fit into this category that we're considering bringing to you guys because the family wants them told, but they just might not come with interviews attached. So hopefully, yeah, you guys understand where we're at with that. We still, are in the good graces of these people and want to help them. But doing an interview for a story like this can be a little bit difficult. So, with that being said, the nutshell version of this story is really fascinating and really sad. It's about a guy who had all the prospects in the world as a basketball player. He was very, very talented and went through what a lot of talented athletes go through, which is scouting. The potential to go on and play college ball and even go pro. But ultimately, as we all know, the percentage of people that ultimately make it through all of that is relatively low. And even though Rico Harris certainly had the talent, there were a couple things in his life that held him back. And a lot of them had to do ultimately, unfortunately, with some serious substance abuse issues that he ran into. And whether or not that comes into play for what ultimately happened to him here, which is he went missing in 2014, we are trying to get to the bottom of, and we're curious to hear what you guys think after we tell the entire story, because this is a guy who had been through a lot of issues, but also fought his way through them and had come out on top. But as we all know, with issues like these, sometimes they're not gone forever, right? So Miles, in order to get into this, why don't you just kind of back us all the way up? Why don't we talk about who was Rico Harris, and then we'll move into the events of his disappearance.
Rico, like most of us, wasn't just one thing, right? Rico was an athlete. Rico was a son, a brother, and Rico was a man with some problems as well. He was born on March 19th, 1977. He grew up in Alhambra, which is sort of in the eastern part of Los Angeles. If you, those of you who are familiar with it, it's interesting. He was actually the son of a former basketball player. His dad was named Henry Harris, And Henry actually played for the Auburn Tigers in college, and then he was actually drafted to the Houston Rockets when he graduated college. So he was kind of a natural athlete, stemming from his dad. And when he went to college, he also played ball. He was 6'9". A lot of people compared him to Lamar Odom, basically like a big guy who was sort of able to do it all. So he was kind of like a Swiss Army knife, within the game. He was considered a serious prospect on the college level, and even for the NBA. So in 1999, Rico was playing for Cal State Northridge, and then he was actually declared for the NBA draft, but ultimately he didn't get drafted in 1999. But then in 2000, after he graduated, he actually played for the Harlem Globetrotters. Now, I guess they're still around, Sean. I'm not even sure, but when I
Yeah,
was a
they're
kid,
around.
I remember actually like going with my Boy Scout troop to like see the Harlem Globetrotters play. And basically, what the Globetrotters are is they're kind of like almost like a permanent exhibition team that go out, and it's kind of part entertainment. Sometimes it's sort of teamed up with what's the word I'm looking for? Like almost like there'll be like an anti-drug thing, for the kids, and then the Harlem Globetrotters will do an exhibition, and sometimes it's just an exhibition kind of game. But these guys are really, really top level athletes. Like they're usually top level ball players. Sometimes they're guys who have already played professionally, and then they kind of go to the Globetrotters later in their careers. And sometimes it's guys like Rico who are actually drafted onto the Globetrotters. So long story short, he doesn't get into the regular NBA draft. He does get onto the Globetrotters, but he plays for them for less than a year. And then there's this incident in Rico's life, in his personal life. And basically, what happens is, not to get too deep into the details, but there's a fight, a street fight that Rico's involved with. It, by all accounts, from what we've been able to find out, it did involve a woman. And within that brawl, Rico gets hit with a baseball bat, and he gets hit in the head. And it actually leads to him having headaches, and he sort of like has trouble with his balance. And basically, he's not able to play ball anymore, and he has to leave the team. So, as you can imagine, this is a kid he's a legacy player. His father was a player. He's a ball player. This is his whole life. He's been playing since his whole life, and playing like semi-pro since junior college. He has to move back in with his mom, and this kind of starts a road that goes on for about 7 years, from like 2000 to 2007, of various substances and not holding jobs, and just really, really not doing very well. And there's a lot of alcohol, there's prescription drugs, there's harder stuff as well, and there's over 100 arrests. Mostly they're alcohol related. The arrests being alcohol related, but there's over 100 arrests that Rico has within this period of 2000 to 2007. So 2007, Rico turns 30, and he actually, soon after his 30th birthday, he actually has an OD. He overdoses on prescription drugs. Now, this apparently leads Rico to finally getting some help. He enters into a rehab that's run by the Salvation Army, and he gets sober. It takes him a while. He's working the program for quite a while, and he's living in this place, but he does get sober. When he gets out of that rehab, he moves in with another guy that was actually a graduate of the same program. And they're kind of like helping each other out and helping each other get back on their feet. He finds a steady job. He starts working as a security guard. And sometime within this period, and I'm not saying it's in 2007, but between 2007 and about 2012, Rico meets a woman named Jennifer Song. She's an insurance broker, and she's from Seattle, Washington, but he does meet her in the LA area, in the larger LA area. And they start carrying on a sort of long distance relationship, with her actually living in Seattle and him living down in LA, but visiting each other, staying in touch, the way people do long distance relationships. In general, during this period, it does seem like Rico's rebuilding his life. He's getting back on his feet. He's doing the things that happen after you spend almost a decade, abusing drugs and alcohol and having arrests. And he's got a sort of lower level job. He's trying to build back his reputation, build back his credit, all of those things, right? In 2014, Rico and Jennifer are actually starting to take the next step in their relationship. And what that step is that Rico's going to permanently move to Seattle. So he's kind of going back and forth at this point, but he's already set himself up with a Washington license. He's set up some job interviews. He's got a job interview as a property appraiser, which was kind of a big deal. Obviously, like, having been working as a security guard, with his criminal record and everything. And now, he'd kind of rebuilt his reputation enough that he was able to secure an interview for, a good job as a property appraiser. So it really, really seemed like Rico was setting himself up for a fresh start, with, having built this relationship with Jennifer to the point where they were going to move in together, deciding to move to Seattle, get out of LA where, he had this history, not only, positive stuff of like his basketball and his family, but also, this long period of time that he spent, not doing such great stuff. He was moving to a new place and getting a fresh start. And he was, working really hard to set up job interviews and, relocate and all that. And that's sort of around the time when Rico's story takes a very strange turn.
Yeah, this really does seem like the moment where things definitely go a little bit off the rails. And Rico, obviously, like everything you just told us, had been living a difficult life. I think it's easy to say. 7 years of substance abuse and kind of figuring out what to do with himself, and then 7 years pretty much of trying to get his life back on track after he got sober. That's a long time. But after meeting Jennifer and figuring out that he wants to move to this other state up in Washington and getting a job which, by the way, like you talked about, a property appraiser it has nothing to do with being an athlete. It's kind of an interesting move for Rico that he's looking at getting into a skilled profession that doesn't just rely on what he's relied on his whole life. So this is really the opening of a new chapter. And in order to close the old one out, he takes this final visit down to LA, down to Alhambra, to see his mother and his younger brother. It's very quick. This doesn't take very long. He drives down from Washington and is only there for a couple hours. What he does when he's there is he takes his younger brother out for some food. He gives him a gift of a cell phone, basically just a sibling to sibling chat. And then I think what Rico really wanted to do is what he did next, and that is have a sit down privately with his mother. We don't know the specifics of what were discussed, but we do know that his mother later said Rico was hoping to get something out of this conversation with her that he ultimately didn't really get. She said that he kind of walked away feeling a little unfulfilled by this talk that they had, which would have taken place later in the evening, maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Um, I think speculation, you do the math, right? This is a guy, again, who had lived with her during the most troubled times of his life, who was now trying to turn it around. He had a girl he was living with in another state. They probably talked about all of that. There might have been some apologizing. There might have been some seeking of sort of a sign off on what he wanted to do now with his life. And whatever it was, it really is between them. And I think we can all imagine what it's like when we have difficult stuff and we're talking to a parent. It was some version of that. What matters is that Rico doesn't really leave in a good place. And he decides to leave that night, even though he had only been in town for a couple hours. He leaves around midnight of October 9th, going into October 10th. So right after midnight would have been October 10th. And he's going to drive all the way back to Seattle, which is over 1,000 miles away. So what happens is he tries to make this drive, and around 10 and a half hours later, 10:45 a.m., he's up past Sacramento in California. If any of you have ever made the drive from LA to Sacramento, you know it's a really long one. He calls Jennifer around 10:45 and she doesn't pick up, but he leaves her a message and says, "Hey, still driving on my way back. I'm past Sacramento, but I'm really, really tired. I barely slept when I was down in LA. And so I'm going to drive up into the mountains that I'm near right now and sleep a little bit." So the area north of Sacramento is pretty rural. There are a lot of mountains, there's parks, there's rivers, there's streams. I know when a lot of us picture California, maybe we're picturing the beach in Santa Monica or Venice, or maybe we're picturing downtown San Francisco or something. If you've ever been to this part of the state, it's not like either of those, right? There's not a lot of people around. It's little country roads, it's trees, it's fields, it's rural, right? So this is where Rico decides to go and take a rest. Interestingly, an hour after he places this call to Jennifer, his phone turns off. We figure that out later through forensics, but we know that it's only an hour that his phone remains on after that call, and it's the last time anybody's going to hear from him.
The entire next day, because remember, it's late at night when Rico calls Jennifer. The entire next day, nobody hears from him. So towards the end of the day, Jennifer's actually starting to get worried because she's like, well, he's supposed to have gotten back on the road. It's probably about 15 to 17 hours to get from, the area that he was in to Seattle, Washington, and if he was going to do a straight drive. And, obviously she would have expected him to check in, if not just eventually show up. So he doesn't show up, and Jennifer's concerned. So she calls Rico's mom, Margaret. Now, at this point, you have to remember Rico's past. So this is where you have to go back and you have to actually look at the profile, the character profile of the person that we're talking about and what their experience was, right? Because this is a point in the story where a lot of people are apt to jump in and say, well, they messed up. Oh, they should have reported him missing right away. But they had years of experience with this guy, and they knew that his MO was that sometimes he would go off grid for a couple of days. That was just how he dealt with things, right? Rico was the kind of guy that, like, every now and then he would take a couple of days and he would kind of go and be to himself, and then he would come back and he'd be kind of reset, right? And that's a thing that he is known to do. Okay. So, they're both wondering, like, maybe this is what he's doing, right? So they kind of sit it out. And they're in communication. Jennifer and Margaret are in communication, and they both agree, okay, let's see. Hope he's probably going to show up here in a couple of days. He's doing one of his things, right? So by October 14th, which is, he left on the night of the 9th, right? This is 4 full days later. He still hasn't shown up, and nobody's heard anything from him, and obviously his mom's been trying to reach him, his girlfriend's been trying to reach him. Nobody's heard a thing. So at this point, Rico's mom, Margaret, does report him missing to the Alhambra police. And at the same time, while she's reporting him missing to the police, something else is unfolding hundreds of miles away in Yolo County, California. Now, to understand where Alhambra is in relation to where we're going next, we're going to put up a little map that will show you, and we can actually show you kind of like, we don't know the exact path that Rico took, but we can show you, where he started, where we know he started from his mom's house to where his car is found in Yolo County. So you guys can see that right now. Now, this is where a Yolo County sheriff's deputy notices this black Nissan Maxima parked in a county parking lot. And he had seen it the previous day, but hadn't thought anything of it. But then he comes back the next day and he sees the car again. So this time he checks inside of it. And the car is actually open. It's unlocked. He opens the door. And what he finds inside is a wallet, credit cards. There's actual CDs scattered everywhere, which for the time period isn't that weird. There's papers, and there's nearly an empty fuel tank in the car. The battery's almost dead. And there's two liquor bottles in the car. One's empty and one's partially full. So this is Rico's car. And I guess I'm getting a little, I feel bad saying this because it's kind of like, in the story, you're kind of rooting for the guy, but what they do find in the car are liquor bottles. So as I said, one's empty, one's full. Battery's almost dead. Fuel tank's almost dead. There's CDs scattered everywhere. It's almost got the feeling that like someone was spending time in this car, right? There's no signs of violence, according to the police. There's no signs of a struggle or anything like that. There's no blood splatters or anything like that. It just looks like someone was doing their thing in this car. So at this point, the deputy runs the plates. He finds that the car has not been reported stolen. It is Rico's car. So he calls Alhambra PD because that's where the car is registered. That's where Rico had the car registered, and finds out, boom, the owner, Rico Harris, has just been reported missing by his mother, Margaret, the exact same day. So now there's a connection made between the Yolo County Police and the Alhambra PD, because the Yolo County Police obviously have the car, and the Alhambra PD now have this missing person report from Margaret, right? Alhambra PD does contact Margaret and tell them, like, hey, they found your son's car, but they haven't found your son. What happens next is a search. So Yolo County puts together a search and rescue team, and they search the entire terrain of Cache Creek Canyon, which is where Rico has gone missing, right? So this is like a forested area. There's creeks, there's streams. It's rugged, right? So they get out ATVs, they've got helicopters. They even bring out an airplane that has a thermographic camera on it that flies over the area, kind of, looking for heat signatures, right? They bring out search dogs. And they do an area within a 5 mile radius of the parking lot, as well as a 27-mile radius of Route 16, which kind of cuts through the canyon, right? Because I guess the assumption is with so many days that have passed, he could have, gone on the move and he could have like ended up going off of the freeway or something. And, he could have been anywhere around there, right? So the search goes on for 3 days and nobody finds anything. And at this point, everyone's scratching their heads because you're looking at, a 6'9", 300-pound man. Okay. This is not a small person. This is an extreme, abnormally large human, actually. And everyone's wondering how the heck someone this size could have disappeared. I mean, it's literally just a simple fact of just his body mass and the fact that like they are going through all these different search techniques that they can't find any sign of him. And everyone's just really, really scratching their heads at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that they were kind of hoping that Rico's description would bring out some witnesses, right? Because, like you mentioned, I mean, that's a guy that's hard to miss. I think even Shaq at his heaviest in the NBA was like 280, right? Rico's got 20 pounds on Shaq and he's about the same height. That's a hard guy to miss, right? And so they start circulating flyers, and obviously there's, press announcements about a missing person that the law enforcement in the area are looking for this guy, and some witnesses do come forward. It's mostly people who have driven by this route, which is it's an interesting route. I guess we can look at the map again if we need to. It's Route 16, which branches off from the 5. Interstate 5 is what goes all the way up from the basically Mexico to Canada on the West Coast. You can drive all the way through all the Western coast states on that. So why Rico would have left the 5 to begin with? Well, you just have to go back to that voicemail that he left for Jennifer. He must have been seeking a quiet place to go take a rest. That's the only thing that makes sense. So there's people that are on this route that see somebody fitting his description. One of them says they saw somebody that looked like Rico walking along the road on October 11th, which would have been the day after this whole drive took place. And if that was him, that means that Rico was alive into the next day, which is very interesting. Another motorist comes forward and says that they believe they saw Rico sitting on a guardrail overlooking this creek in this little nature area that he had pulled over. Now, if this was anybody else, like if it was Miles or myself or almost anyone else in America, it'd be kind of easy to say, well, maybe they just didn't see the right person. But again, we're talking about a 6'9", 300-pound basketball player in the middle of a pretty middle of nowhere spot. It's hard to mistake that. My
It's a
inclination.
guy who sticks out, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's we're hammering this point, but I mean, you have to think about this, guys. Like, this is a person who is a very unique individual, visually, right?
yeah. And so the idea that this was a misidentification is always there, of course, but the fact that Rico's so unique physically, it makes it seem pretty convincing to me that maybe he was there and these people really did see him. And that will kind of come into play as far as trying to theorize what might have happened. So then October 18th, one of the most interesting eyewitness reports comes forward. So again, October 18th is 8 days after Rico took the drive away from his mother's house up to Seattle and went missing. So on this day, a person reports that they had driven past the parking lot where Rico's Nissan was when the sheriff's deputy found it several days earlier. And this witness says that he saw a large man matching Rico's description that was wearing light colored pants walking in that area. Now, Rico was wearing light colored pants. And again, a large person matching Rico's description is not going to be someone you easily come across in this place. I hate to return to that and hit it even harder, but it's interesting to me because it would mean that if this person really was walking around on October 18th, that Rico was still in the area, still on foot, even after the searches had taken place and even after the authorities had come and taken his car away. So you have two possibilities here. Either this guy didn't see what he thought he saw and it wasn't Rico, or Rico was there, and this is even weirder than anybody ever thought. So with this new report, the authorities go back out to the area where Rico's car was found and recovered several days earlier, and they find something really interesting. A set of fresh size 18 footprints, which is the size that Rico wore, leading from the area of the parking lot where the car was down to the creek. which was nearby. So this is really interesting. And it lends some credence to what that witness had said that maybe Rico was still out here walking around. So they continue to look more in the area now. Obviously, things are getting more and more interesting, and they find more. They are able to find Harris's backpack, which was by the side of a road about 1,500 feet from the guardrail overlooking that creek that one of the earlier witnesses said that they thought they saw Rico sitting on. Um, Inside of this backpack, they find Rico's phone, his charger, and a couple other just normal items like you would have, coins and chapstick and stuff, maybe in a backpack. Um, they look on the phone and they find pictures of the creek, the nearby creek, as well as some selfies that Rico has taken, including one in which he's standing in front of a nearby sign that welcomes drivers to Yolo County, and he's kind of striking a playful pose. So if all you saw was these photos on the phone, you'd think he pulled over to just take some tourist photos and have a little fun, right? He's taking selfies by a river. He's taking some selfies by a sign. There's really no sign of foul play or anything that is disturbing on these, except for the fact that Rico himself is a missing person, which casts a disturbing light over the entire situation, right? Um, on the phone, there's also some video. Now, this is interesting because it looks like the video was taken unintentionally. Like Rico was pawing through some stuff in his car and accidentally turned on the record on his phone. And what it shows is him basically with music playing in the car. He's driving, singing along a little bit, and he's kind of like rifling through CDs and throwing them around like you used to do. Any of you who are old enough to remember having like the book of CDs in your car, you pull through them, you're looking for your favorite mix, whatever. That's basically what he was doing. Again, nothing nefarious going on. It's possible he was intoxicated at that point, but it's hard to say for sure. But there's nobody with him. He doesn't seem suicidal. He's doing what most of us do on a long drive, looking for music, singing along, just going down the road. So this is basically all that we have of Rico as far as physical evidence goes. These footprints, the way the car was found, the sightings, and the backpack with these strange pictures and video. It's crazy that since then, there's just been no sight of him. Nothing new has turned up. No more eyewitness accounts. Rico, if he is alive or was alive, never called his mother again, never called Jennifer again, and remarkably was never seen again, which you would have think, he probably would have been, because he's hard to miss, right? So what do you think? What do you make of this, Miles? I mean, this is really, really odd.
Let's start with what the authorities think before we get into what we think, right? What seems to be the investigators who actually looked into the case, what seems to be their leading theory is the typical there was an accident, there was exposure to the elements. This was a guy who took a wrong turn, became disoriented and probably succumbed to the elements, succumbed to exposure, whatever. The big problem with that is that over the years, there's been lots of searches. There's been very intensive searches using technology, using dogs, using helicopters, and there's never been any remains found of Rico. So, that in and of itself, it's strange, right? That nothing's ever been found. The second leaning theory from that's been posited by some of the authorities is that this was sort of a voluntary disappearance, right? Detective Dean Nyland, who actually, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, who was part of the investigation, actually suggested that maybe Rico found the place peaceful. He wandered the area, came back, found that his car has been towed, and then basically like said, "Well, what am I going to do?" Took a ride, from someone else, hitchhiked or whatever, and that was it. And who knows where he went? Problem with that is that we know that he left behind his wallet, he left behind his backpack, he left behind his phone. He never contacted Jennifer ever again since he had turned off his phone the night of the 9th. He had this job interview that he was supposed to get to. Didn't think about that. And he's never accessed his finances, which obviously, he didn't have any of his IDs or anything, so that might have been difficult. But it's difficult to sort of reconcile this idea of a voluntary disappearance against what the evidence is. And I think I always have a problem with this idea of voluntary disappearances, Sean. And, we've talked about it in regards to other cases. And it always comes up that, like, well, he or she just wanted to get out of there and they went off grid and they built a new life. And, they're probably on a beach in Mexico. And I think that's a very romantic idea that is, as we've talked about previously in other episodes, it's very, very difficult to pull off. And it's even more difficult to pull off when you don't have your ID, you don't have your phone, you don't have a way to access your finances. It's a very, very hard thing to do. But not saying that it can't be done, but it would take pre-planning, and it doesn't seem like that's what Rico was pre-planning. It seems like Rico was very carefully planning a move to Seattle to start a new life. So what does that leave us with? Theory three, and this is a favorite amongst our internet sleuths, which is that there was foul play, right? So this is something that's discussed a lot online, and I'm sure people are going to weigh in on the comments and have thoughts about this. So the problem with foul play is that there's very little evidence to support it. I would say there's no evidence to support it, right? There's no evidence of a struggle. There's no evidence that another person was even present at any point with Rico. I mean, he was, there's the eyewitness accounts of seeing him, but there's no one that said they interacted with him in any way, and there's no one that said that they saw him interacting with him in any way. Also, what was found on the phone, right? The inadvertently shot videos show that Rico was actually alone when he was in the car. I know that's earlier on, and he was missing for many, many days. And there is evidence that perhaps he had stayed in that area for almost, what is it, Sean? Like a week, right? Like 8 days,
Yeah.
from when he first parks the car there to, and those videos are shot to when those fresh tracks are found. I think it's full 8 days later. Um, but there's nothing to suggest that Rico was interacting with other people or anything like that. So, look, I think I always believe that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever you're left with is the truth, no matter how improbable it may be, right? But I don't know that we've eliminated, the other things yet, which are accident, exposure, or even the voluntary disappearance before we can jump to something nefarious happened to Rico, right? What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, it's one of those ones where it's just everything here is a contradiction, and it's hard to know what the truth of the matter really is. I mean, did these people really see Rico up to 8 days after, when the area had been searched with dogs, helicopters, airplanes, scuba divers, you know, people on ATVs? I mean, where would this guy have been? What was he eating for 8 days without, without his credit cards, which were all in the car, without any cash? All he would have had is his backpack with a phone and an ID. That's a start, but it doesn't really buy you water or food. So I don't know what to make of that. Did they see somebody else? Is there another guy matching that description that just happened to be in this area? I really don't know. I think that you've covered the main possibilities. It does feel like foul play at that place seems unlikely. In other words, I don't feel in my little amateur detective's heart that Rico pulled off into that parking lot and somebody surprised him there. But I could see a scenario where, because he was kind of clearly using again and had stopped there for a good amount of time, he might have left that area with somebody else to go do something else, maybe to go get drugs, maybe to go find food, maybe someone offered him a ride, and that could have gone south or gotten weird, and he could have fallen in with somebody completely unrelated that just has yet to be discovered, and that would explain some of this. And then maybe he even went away with some people and came back to get his car, but it had been towed by the police by that point, which might explain the footprints, the sightings. I don't know. It's one possibility. And I think even the detective, Dean Nyland, that you mentioned, has kind of brought that up himself. Like, it's possible that he came back here after the car was towed because he was expecting to get back to his car and it was gone. And then where he went from there is anyone's guess. What disturbs me is that he never contacted his mother again. And there is something I wanted to say about that, because we talk about this last interaction that they had where she has said, it didn't go the way that it seemed like Rico wanted it to go. He didn't really get from that conversation what he wanted. But I want to be clear. His mom it completely loves Rico. Um, there was no split there as far as that goes. I think they had their disagreements. I think Rico was leading a troubled life and his mother was concerned for him. But in our conversation with Margaret, she had nothing but concern and love for her son. You know what I mean? So just
And
to
she
be
had a
clear,
relationship with Jennifer, and I think that's
yeah,
important too. That,
yeah,
anyone who's thinking like, oh, well, maybe she thought, this was a bad move on his part. She was in contact with his girlfriend. They had
yeah.
each other's phone numbers and they were talking to each other. So I think that's important to note.
Exactly. So just to be clear, in case anybody got the wrong idea that after that conversation, the relationship had split, and maybe that's why he never called her. It wasn't like that. We've all had conversations with our family or our spouse or whatever that's difficult and they don't go the way that we want. But it doesn't mean the relationship's over forever. It just means we're going to try this again later, or we're still working through something together, right? And I think it was more along those lines than anything else. So it is unusual that he never contacted her. It's super unusual that he never contacted Jennifer again. So it's possible that he's still out there today. I don't think anyone's completely written that off, although it gets more and more unlikely with each passing month, day, year. But when you have somebody who has this level of trouble with substances and really serious substances, there can be, fugue states, mental events that, lead them to wander off and lose contact with people for a while. Again, this long, now we're kind of pushing the boundary of what you'd expect to see, but certainly in the beginning, there is a part of me that understands that maybe he was around there for up to a week or two, just kind of on a mental break, right? Drugs and walking
Right.
around and doing God knows what. I mean, people do this all the time. If you drive through downtown LA, you'll see a lot of people whose families don't know if they're alive or dead, right? They're just having a really hard time mentally or they're on drugs. Like this happens, right? It sucks. We don't want to admit it to ourselves, but it does happen. I don't know if that's the case here or not, but certainly the background suggests it's a possibility. And that's my reading about it. I really don't know. This one is one that's very mysterious to me. It seems like if he was alive, he would have turned up. But then I can't imagine where he went if he's not alive. It's
Right. Well, the problem is that the extensiveness of the search, right? And Rico's size and everything, and you would think that they would have found something. But listen, the wilderness is the wilderness, right? I mean, we've seen this over and over again where people disappear, and sometimes they do eventually pop up, and when terrain is rugged and there's like little crevices and stuff, and like who knows, I think there's a lot of possibilities here. I mean, Rico's remains may be in some like little tucked in area that nobody has found. And, you know, it sounds terrible to say, but like, he curled up in there one night and never came out,
Mhm.
there's other possibilities too. I mean, maybe there's a wild man of Yoko County, who's out there and it's Rico and he decided, to hell with it. I'm not going to deal with any of this stuff anymore, and I'm gonna just I'm gonna live out here. Maybe he figured out a way to do that, and that's that first week of as Sean was saying, of not having water and food. He figured that out, and then he owned it. Then maybe he did catch a ride after his car was towed, and maybe he did get out of there, and maybe he is somewhere else. Maybe Rico's working at a diner somewhere in another state and just said, screw it, I'm going to start over. Maybe he's in downtown LA,
Yeah.
maybe he's on a permanent bender. I mean, it's obvious, I think, we can accept that whatever happened in between leaving Alhambra and ending up in this parking lot, Rico definitely, fell off the wagon, and
Mhm.
maybe it was just a little bit. Maybe it was just those 2 bottles of liquor that were found in the car, and it's nothing compared to, what he had been through and what he had gotten past. But I think we can all accept that there was a bump in his recovery uh, during this time, and maybe he just didn't come back from that. So it's not to say that he's not alive, but maybe he's just off somewhere, living not such a great life, which is a shame because he did seem to really, really be on the right track, and he was setting himself up for a new chapter with Jennifer and with a life in Seattle, and these job interviews that he had set up and everything else. I mean, look, what we know is that it's more than a decade later. Rico's still missing. His car was found. There's the videos on his cell phone, the people that have seen him, the footprints. I mean, there's an unusually detailed picture of this guy's last days, between these sightings and these videos that were shot, and the footprints in the mud. But everything kind of comes back to this creek, but then they dredged the creek, they looked in the creek, he's not been found. Because that's the first thing when we first started talking about this case. To me, it was like, well, obviously he drowned in that creek, right? That's where he is. But
Mhm.
they've searched it. It's not the Atlantic Ocean. I don't
Right.
think he's in there. So
Yeah.
he
Well, and
seems to have disappeared into thin air, honestly. Well, listen,
very.
guys, Sean and I could probably go on forever sort of like trying to pick this apart and coming to no conclusion because it is such a mystery. But why don't you let us know what you think? Nobody here is ever hesitant to drop their opinion in our comments. So let's go. Let's have a conversation about it. We'll get in there and we'll chop it up with you guys, and let's talk about what may have happened. Again, we have had several conversations with Rico's mom. If her position as far as not wanting to appear on camera, not do an interview changes, we will follow this up at some point with a long form interview with her. But in the meantime, let this stand as our analysis of the Rico Harris case. And let's have a conversation about it, and then we'll probably do a comment react next week to sort of analyze what you guys had to say about the case.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for watching. Can't wait to hear what you all think, and we will see you next week in the comments.